So there I was, sitting in this cramped lawyer's office on the outskirts of Detroit, surrounded by family members who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. You know that feeling when you're at a family gathering and everyone's just waiting for the awkward part to be over? Yeah, that was us after Grandpa's funeral. The estate executor, this guy who looked like he'd been doing this job since the Carter administration, started reading off the will in that monotone voice all lawyers seem to master. My cousin Jake got the small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. But hey, free real estate in this economy. My Aunt Linda scored Grandpa's 1998 Chevrolet, which honestly wasn't much to look at, but ran like a dream because the old man maintained that thing like it was a Ferrari. My second cousin, Sarah, got a decent-sized plot of land out in the sticks, which had everyone thinking she hit the jackpot. Rural property around Detroit wasn't exactly Silicon Valley pricing, but land is land, right? Everyone was getting something that made sense, something with actual value. Then came my turn. The lawyer cleared his throat and looked at me over his reading glasses like he was about to deliver bad news. And boy, did he ever. I got a handful of old tools that looked like they belonged in a museum, a stack of automotive manuals from the 1970s that smelled like motor oil and disappointment, and this small metal key wrapped in a piece of old cloth. The key had some engraving on it that read RYC 208. Real cryptic stuff that meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. The room got quiet in that uncomfortable way where you can practically hear everyone's thoughts. I'm sitting there staring at this random key, feeling like I just got punked by a dead guy. My cousin Jake couldn't resist breaking the silence with one of his classic smartass remarks about how the mechanic left me some scrap metal. My aunt chimed in with something about it, probably being the key to an empty shed somewhere. Everyone started chuckling, but not in a mean way. More like that nervous laughter you do when something's awkward and you don't know how else to react. I just sat there holding this key, feeling its weight in my palm. It was heavier than you'd expect for something so small, cold to the touch, with that engraving carved deep and precise. Here's the thing about my grandpa. He never did anything without a reason. This was a guy who organized his garage like a military operation, labeled everything twice, and planned his grocery trips like D-Day. Random wasn't in his vocabulary. So while everyone else was making jokes, I'm thinking there's got to be more to this story. The lawyer just shrugged when I asked if there was anything else. Apparently, the will specifically mentioned that I should know what to do with it. Classic grandpa move, being cryptic even from beyond the grave. The guy always loved his puzzles and riddles. Used to drive me crazy as a kid with his treasure hunt games around the house. After we left the office, the family scattered pretty quickly. Jake was already making plans to fix up his new house, probably thinking about flipping it for a quick profit. Linda was talking about selling the Chevrolet to some collector she knew. Sarah was Googling land values on her phone before we even got to the parking lot. Meanwhile, I'm standing there with a key that could open anything or nothing, feeling like I got the consolation prize in the world's most depressing game show. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. Grandpa spent his whole life working on cars, fixing things, building stuff with his hands. He wasn't the type to leave someone empty-handed, especially not me. We used to spend summers together when I was young, back when my parents were going through their messy divorce. He'd let me hang around his garage, teaching me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, showing me how to change oil and replace brake pads. Those were some of the best times of my childhood, just me, him, and whatever broken-down car he was bringing back to life. He always said that every problem has a solution. You just have to know where to look. Sometimes the answer is right in front of you, hiding in plain sight. At the time, I thought he was just talking about carburetor problems and transmission issues. Now I'm wondering if he was trying to teach me something bigger. The key felt warm in my pocket during the drive home, like it was trying to tell me something. I kept pulling it out at red lights, studying that engraving, trying to figure out what RYC 208 could possibly mean. Was it an address? A combination? Some kind of code? My apartment felt smaller than usual that night. I spread out all the stuff I inherited on my kitchen table. The old wrenches, the worn-out manuals, and that mysterious key. The tools were definitely vintage, probably worth something to the right collector, but nothing spectacular. The manuals were mostly for cars from the muscle car era, full of technical diagrams and specifications that brought back memories of Grandpa explaining horsepower and torque ratios. I kept coming back to that key, though. It wasn't just any old key. This thing was made to last. Heavy brass or bronze, with a unique cut pattern that looked professional. The engraving was precise, done by someone who knew what they were doing. This wasn't some hardware store duplicate or spare house key. The cloth it was wrapped in was interesting, too. Looked like part of an old shop rag, the kind mechanics used to wipe their hands. It had stains that could have been oil or grease, and it smelled like Grandpa's garage. That mixture of motor oil, metal shavings, and something else I couldn't quite place. I decided to do some detective work. Started going through old photo albums, looking for any clues about what this key might open. Found plenty of pictures of Grandpa with various cars over the years, but nothing that jumped out at me. There were shots of him at work, at home, at family gatherings, but no mysterious doors or locks that matched my key. Then I remembered something he used to say when I was little. Whenever I'd ask him about his past, about his work, about the cars he'd owned, he'd get this look in his eyes, like he was remembering something important but couldn't quite share it yet. He'd always end those conversations the same way, telling me that someday I'd understand, that everything would make sense when the time was right. Sitting there in my kitchen at midnight, staring at this key and feeling like I was missing something obvious, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was that moment he'd been talking about. The moment when everything was supposed to click into place. Problem was, I felt more confused than ever. But if there's one thing I learned from Grandpa, it's that giving up isn't an option. When you're stuck on a problem, you don't quit. You approach it from a different angle. So I made myself a promise that night. I was going to figure out what this key opened, even if it took me all year. Little did I know that this little piece of metal was about to turn my entire world upside down. Sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest secrets, and Grandpa's final gift was about to prove that in ways I never could have imagined. The next morning, I started with the obvious stuff. You know how it is when you lose your keys. You check all the usual spots first, even though you know they're probably somewhere completely random. That's exactly what I did with Grandpa's mystery key, except I was looking for locks instead of keys. First stop was his old garage behind the house. This place was like a shrine to American automotive history. Tools organized by size, vintage car posters covering every inch of wall space, and that smell of motor oil that never quite goes away. I tried the key on every lock I could find. The main door, the tool cabinets, even that old filing cabinet where he kept his paperwork. Nothing. The key didn't fit anything. Next, I hit up the workshop he'd built in the basement. Grandpa was one of those guys who could fix literally anything. Washing machines, lawn mowers, you name it. He had this whole setup down there, with a workbench that looked like it belonged in a professional shop. Again, I tried every lock, every drawer, every cabinet. Still nothing. The key was starting to feel like a cruel joke. Getting desperate, I decided to expand my search. Remember, this was a guy who'd worked on cars his whole life, so maybe he had some storage unit or rental space I didn't know about. I drove over to Murphy's Garage Cooperative, this place where old-school mechanics rent out bays to work on their projects. The owner, Big Mike, remembered Grandpa well. Big Mike was this massive guy with hands like baseball gloves and a voice that sounded like he'd been chain smoking since the Eisenhower administration. He walked me around the facility, showing me the bay Grandpa used to rent back in the day. The lock was completely different, some modern electronic thing that would have made my antique key look like a museum piece. Mike confirmed that Grandpa had stopped renting there sometime in the early 2000s. I was starting to feel like an idiot, wandering around Detroit with this random key, bothering people who were just trying to get their work done. But something kept nagging at me. Grandpa wasn't the type to leave loose ends. Every project he started, he finished. Every problem he encountered, he solved. This key had to open something. That's when I remembered the locksmith shop on 8 Mile Road. This old-timer named Eddie had been cutting keys and fixing locks since before I was born. If anyone could tell me what this key was for, it'd be him. The guy took one look at it and let out this low whistle that told me he knew exactly what he was looking at. Eddie explained that it was definitely a garage key, but from way back in the day, He mentioned something about the style being popular in the 1970s, mainly used for industrial spaces or private storage facilities. The cut pattern was unique too, not your typical residential lock. This was designed for something more secure, more permanent. The whole thing was starting to drive me crazy. I'd been carrying this key around for weeks, and all I had to show for it was a bunch of dead ends and a growing collection of weird looks from people who thought I'd lost my mind. I was seriously considering just putting the thing in a drawer and forgetting about it. But that night, while I was going through more grandpa stuff, I found something that changed everything. Hidden between the pages of an old Chilton repair manual was a folded piece of paper, an electricity bill from Detroit Edison, dated 1979. The name on the account was definitely Grandpa's, but the address wasn't his house. It was 527 Industrial Avenue, Box 4. I stared at that address for a solid 10 minutes, trying to figure out why it seemed familiar. Then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Industrial Avenue was where Grandpa used to take me sometimes when I was around 10 years old. I remembered those trips because they were different from our usual garage visits. We'd drive down this long, dusty road lined with old warehouse buildings and abandoned factories. The whole area had this post-apocalyptic vibe, like something out of a movie about the decline of American manufacturing. Most of the buildings were empty, covered in graffiti, with broken windows and weeds growing through the sidewalk cracks. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find anything valuable. I could still picture Grandpa's face during those visits. He'd get this distant look, like he was remembering something important but couldn't quite put it into words. When I'd ask him what we were doing there, he'd just say he used to work in the area and wanted to check on something. He always called his private space, somewhere that was just for him. At the time, I figured he was just being nostalgic. Detroit in the 1980s was full of people who'd worked in the auto industry during the boom years, and a lot of them had a hard time letting go of the past. I assumed those trips to Industrial Avenue were just his way of processing all the changes happening in the city. But now, holding that old electric bill in my hands, I realized there was way more to the story. Grandpa hadn't just worked in that area. He'd actually maintained some kind of space there. Box 4 at 527 Industrial Avenue. The address meant nothing to most people, but to me, it was like finding a treasure map. I spent the rest of the night trying to remember more details about those childhood visits. We never actually went inside any of the buildings, just drove around the area slowly, like he was checking on something. Sometimes he'd park for a few minutes and just sit there, looking at the buildings with this expression I couldn't read. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this was where the key belonged. It made perfect sense. Grandpa was always a private person, someone who kept his most important things close to his chest. If he had a secret space somewhere, Industrial Avenue would be the perfect place for it. Remote, forgotten, the kind of area where nobody asked questions. I tried to sleep that night, but my mind kept racing. What if the building was torn down? What if someone else had taken over the space? What if I was completely wrong about the whole thing? But despite all my doubts, I knew I had to check it out. This was the first real lead I'd had since inheriting the key. The next morning, I loaded up my truck with some basic tools and headed out to Industrial Avenue. The area looked exactly the same as I remembered, maybe a little more rundown, but still that same collection of forgotten buildings and empty lots. Finding 527 took some doing, because half the address markers were missing or faded beyond recognition. When I finally located the building, my heart sank a little. It was this nondescript metal structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The paint was peeling. Weeds were growing up through cracks in the concrete, and there were rust stains running down the walls from years of neglect. But something about the place felt right. It had that same quiet, forgotten atmosphere I remembered from those childhood visits. As I walked around the building, looking for any sign of Box 4, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice telling me that sometimes the most important things are hidden in the most unlikely places. Maybe this rusty old building was exactly where I needed to be. Standing there in front of that rusty old building, I felt like I was finally connecting the dots of a puzzle that had been decades in the making. This was where Grandpa's secret had been hiding all along, behind peeling paint and forgotten concrete. The address from that old electric bill had led me exactly where I needed to be. The main entrance had one of those fancy electronic locks that definitely wasn't from the 1970s. Someone had obviously upgraded the security at some point, probably when they carved the building up into individual storage units. I walked around the perimeter, trying to figure out how the place was laid out and where Boxford might be located. That's when I found it. Around the back of the building, there was this chain-link fence section that looked like it had been installed as an afterthought. Behind the fence was a separate entrance, just a plain metal door with a heavy-duty padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The lock was old, definitely vintage, and covered in a layer of rust that suggested it had been hanging there through countless seasons of Detroit weather. My hands were actually shaking when I pulled out Grandpa's key. This was it, the moment of truth. Either this key was going to open something amazing, or I was about to confirm that I'd been chasing shadows for weeks. I slid the key into the lock, and it went in smooth as butter. One turn to the right, and I heard that satisfying click that every lockpicker dreams about. The padlock practically fell apart in my hands, like it had been waiting decades for someone to finally open it. I pushed through the chain-link gate and walked up to the metal door. It opened with a creak that probably woke up every pigeon in a 5-block radius. The smell hit me immediately, motor oil, metal, and something else that took me right back to childhood visits to Grandpa's garage. Inside was like stepping into a time capsule. The space was bigger than I expected, maybe 30 by 40 feet, with concrete floors and metal walls that had somehow stayed dry despite the building's external condition. There were old fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling, and when I found the light switch, half of them actually worked. The place was set up like a professional garage, with a hydraulic lift in the center and tool cabinets lining the walls. Everything was covered in dust, but underneath you could tell it had been maintained with the same obsessive care Grandpa brought to everything else. There were vintage automotive posters on the walls, including some real collector's items from a muscle car era. But what really caught my attention was the false wall in the corner. It was made from particle board and painted to match the metal walls, but it stuck out like a sore thumb once you knew what to look for. Behind it, I could see the outline of something large covered by a tarp. My heart started racing because I had a pretty good idea what I was about to find. I moved that false wall aside, and there it was, the silhouette of a car under a heavy canvas cover. The cover was held down with bungee cords, and had obviously been there for a very long time. When I started pulling it off, I could see flashes of dark blue paint underneath. By the time I got the whole cover off, I was looking at something that made my knees weak. A 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429, sitting there like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. If you're not a car person, let me explain what this means. The Boss 429 was Ford's answer to the horsepower wars of the late 1960s. They only made about 1,300 of them, and most of those have either been wrecked, modified beyond recognition, or are sitting in collections where nobody ever sees them. This one was perfect, dark blue with black racing stripes, chrome bumpers that still had their shine, and an interior that looked like it had never been sat in. I walked around it slowly, checking for any signs of damage or modification. Nothing. It was completely stock, down to the original bias ply tires and the dealer-installed AM radio. On the passenger seat was a leather folder containing all the paperwork, original title, insurance documents, service records, even the window sticker from the dealership. Everything was in Grandpa's name, and everything was legitimate. This wasn't some barn find that had been sitting in someone's backyard for 50 years. This was a museum-quality car that had been professionally preserved. I found the keys hanging on a hook next to the workbench. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the driver's seat. The interior was absolutely pristine. The vinyl seat still had that new car smell, somehow preserved after all these years. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine turned over but didn't start. Of course it didn't. This car had been sitting for decades, but that didn't matter. Just sitting in that driver's seat, surrounded by perfect 1969 craftsmanship, I finally understood what Grandpa had been doing all those years. This wasn't just a car, it was his masterpiece. While everyone else was buying muscle cars and beating to death on the street, he'd found this one and preserved it exactly as Ford intended. He'd created his own private automotive museum, hidden away where nobody could find it. The whole discovery felt surreal. One minute, I'm thinking I inherited a bunch of junk, and the next I'm looking at what might be the most valuable car in Michigan. I spent the rest of the day going through everything in the garage, trying to piece together how long Grandpa had been keeping this secret. From what I could tell, he bought the car new in 1969 and driven it for maybe a year before deciding it was too special to risk on the street. The odometer showed just over 1,200 miles, which meant it had basically been a garage queen for over 50 years. The maintenance record showed that he'd started it up regularly, changed the oil, and kept everything in perfect working order. There were photos tucked into the service manual showing the car at various car shows in the early 1970s. Grandpa had actually won a few trophies with it, back when the Boss 429 was just another new car rather than a priceless collector's item. But at some point, he decided to take it off the road and preserve it for posterity. The crazy part was that nobody in the family knew about any of this. For decades, Grandpa had been paying rent on this space, maintaining this incredible machine, and keeping the whole thing completely secret. He created this perfect little world where time stood still, where one of the greatest muscle cars ever built could exist exactly as its creators intended. As I sat there in that dusty garage, surrounded by automotive history, I realized that Grandpa had left me something way more valuable than money. He'd left me a piece of American automotive culture, preserved in perfect condition. But more than that, he'd left me a mystery that took weeks to solve, a puzzle that led me on an adventure through Detroit's forgotten corners. The key wasn't just about opening a lock. It was about opening a door to a part of Grandpa's life that none of us knew existed. And now that door was open, I had to figure out what to do with what I'd found. This wasn't just a car. It was a responsibility, a legacy, and possibly the key to my own future. I drove home that day with my mind completely blown and about 300 photos on my phone. The first thing I did was look up the VIN number on the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration database. Everything checked out perfectly. The car was exactly what it appeared to be, manufactured in April 1969 at Ford's Dearborn assembly plant. But here's where things got interesting. The last registration on file was from 1981, which meant Grandpa had taken off the road 40-plus years ago and somehow managed to keep it legal all this time. The title was clean, no liens, no issues. From a legal standpoint, this was a legitimate vehicle that just happened to be worth more than most people's houses. I spent the next few days going through more of Grandpa's paperwork, looking for any other clues about the car's history. Buried in a shoebox full of old receipts, I found the original sales contract from Tosca Ford in Rhode Island. Apparently, Grandpa had special ordered this car through a dealer connection, specifying every single option down to color the interior stitching. The purchase price was listed as $4,798, which was serious money in 1969. For comparison, you could buy a decent house in Detroit for about $15,000 back then. This wasn't some impulse purchase. Grandpa had saved up for months to afford his dream car, and then he'd driven it exactly 1,247 miles before deciding it was too precious to risk on the street. I also found insurance documents showing that he kept full coverage on the car for over 50 years, even though it was just sitting in storage. The annual premiums were relatively cheap because the car was listed as a collector vehicle with limited mileage. But still, that's a lot of money to spend on something you're not using. The more I learned about this whole situation, the more I realized that Grandpa had been playing a very long game. He wasn't just storing a car, he was preserving a piece of automotive history. And somehow, he'd managed to keep it completely secret from everyone in the family for decades. Out of curiosity, I started researching what similar cars were selling for at auction. What I found made me seriously consider seeing a cardiologist. Barrett Jackson, the most famous collector car auction in America, had sold a 1969 Boss 429 just 6 months earlier for $374,000. That was for a car with 30,000 miles and some minor modifications. Mine had 1,247 original miles, completely stock, with full documentation and no stories. In collector car terms, this was what they call a survivor, an original car that had never been restored because it never needed to be restored. These are the holy grail of the collector car world, and they bring absolutely insane money at auction. I joined a few online forums dedicated to Boss 429 Mustangs, and within hours of posting some photos, my inbox was flooded with messages from collectors, dealers, and auction houses. One guy from California offered me $250,000 sight unseen. Another collector in Texas said he'd been looking for an original Boss 429 for 20 years and would pay whatever it took. The most interesting response came from a specialist at Barrett-Jackson, who explained that truly original Boss 429s in this condition were incredibly rare. Most have been modified, wrecked, or simply worn out over the years. He estimated that my car could bring anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 at auction, depending on the bidding. Here's the thing, though. I'm not a car collector. I appreciate classic cars, sure, but I'm not the type of guy who can afford to keep a $400,000 vehicle sitting in storage just to look at it occasionally. That kind of money could change my life in some pretty significant ways. It could pay off my student loans, buy me a house, maybe even start a business. But selling it felt wrong somehow. This wasn't just a car. It was Grandpa's masterpiece, his secret project, his way of preserving something beautiful in a world that seemed determined to tear everything down. He'd spent 50 years taking care of this machine, and now he was trusting me to decide what happened next. I spent about a week going back and forth on what to do. Part of me wanted to keep the car and continue Grandpa's work. Part of me wanted to donate it to a museum where everyone could appreciate it. But the practical side of me kept coming back to the money. This was more cash than I'd ever seen in my life, and it was sitting in a dusty garage in Detroit's industrial district. Finally, I made my decision. I was going to sell it, but I was going to do it right. No private sale to some collector who would lock it away in a climate-controlled garage. I wanted this car to get the recognition it deserved, and that meant taking it to a major auction where the whole world could see what Grandpa had preserved. I contacted Barrett-Jackson and explained the situation. They were incredibly excited about the car, especially when I sent them high-resolution photos of the documentation. The specialist I'd been talking to arranged for their transportation team to pick up the car and deliver it to their Scottsdale facility for their next major auction. The whole process took about 2 months from start to finish. They photographed the car professionally, wrote up a detailed description of its history, and featured it prominently in their auction catalog. They even included some of the photos from the 1970s showing Grandpa at car shows with his prize-winning Mustang. When auction day arrived, I flew out to Scottsdale to watch the sale in person. The car was scheduled to cross the block on Saturday evening, during prime time when the biggest collectors were paying attention. I sat in the audience, feeling like I was about to watch 50 years of family history get sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer introduced the car with a detailed explanation of its significance and rarity. When the bidding started at $200,000, I thought my heart might actually stop. But the price kept climbing. $250,000, $300,000, $350,000. When the hammer finally fell at $489,500, I just sat there in stunned silence. After the auction house took their commission, I walked away with about $430,000, more money than I'd ever imagined having, earned from a car I'd never even known existed 2 months earlier. But somehow, sitting in that hotel room in Scottsdale, counting zeros on a cashier's check, I felt like Grandpa was smiling somewhere. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he left me that key. He'd known I'd figure out the puzzle, find the car, and make the right decision about what to do with it. And most importantly, he'd known that I wouldn't just take the money and disappear. He'd raised me better than that, and he was counting on me to do something meaningful with his final gift. The question now was what to do with all that money. I could have bought a house, traveled the world, or just stuck in the bank and lived comfortably for a while. But I kept thinking about Grandpa's garage, about all those years he'd spent working on cars and helping people keep their vehicles running. That's when I knew exactly what I needed to do next. 3 months after the auction, I was standing in front of Martinez Auto Service on the east side of Detroit, holding a set of keys that actually meant something this time. This was the shop where Grandpa had worked for almost 30 years before retiring, and the owner was ready to sell. The building needed work, sure, but had good bones and a reputation in the neighborhood that you can't buy with any amount of money. I've been thinking about this move ever since I got that check from Barrett Jackson. All that money sitting in my bank account felt like borrowed time, like I was supposed to do something important with it, but wasn't sure what. Then I remembered walking through the shop as a kid, watching Grandpa work his magic on cars that other mechanics had given up on. The current owner, Miguel Martinez, was getting ready to retire himself. He'd been running the place for about 15 years, ever since Grandpa stepped down, but he never quite had the same touch with the classic cars. Miguel was great with modern vehicles, but when someone brought in a 1970s muscle car or a vintage truck, he'd always talk about how much he missed having George around to handle the tricky stuff. When I made Miguel an offer for the business, he seemed genuinely relieved. He'd been worried about what would happen to the shop's reputation after he retired, especially since most of the younger mechanics didn't have experience with older vehicles. Knowing that George's grandson was taking over felt like the right kind of continuity. I spent the next month gutting and renovating the place. New paint, better lighting, updated equipment. But I kept all the stuff that mattered. The original hydraulic lifts, the tool cabinets that Grandpa had organized, even the old coffee maker in the break room that somehow still worked perfectly. I wanted the place to feel familiar to the old customers while being professional enough to attract new ones. The most important addition was a display case near the front entrance. Inside, I put Grandpa's original key in a custom frame, along with some photos of him working on cars over the years. The inscription read simply, "For the one who understands, George Thompson, 1935 to 2024. It was my way of honoring the man who'd started all of this with a mysterious key and a 50-year secret. I also brought over some of the tools and memorabilia from Grandpa's hidden garage, the vintage automotive posters, his collection of original shop manuals, even that old hydraulic lift that had been sitting in use for decades. These weren't just decorations. They were functional pieces of automotive history that belonged in a working garage. The shop's specialty became classic car restoration and maintenance. Word spread quickly through the local car community that George Thompson's grandson was carrying on the family tradition. I started getting calls from collectors all over the Midwest who'd heard about the quality of work we were doing. My cousin Jake showed up about a week before the grand opening. He'd been pretty quiet since the family found out about the Mustang and the money, probably feeling a little silly about all those jokes he'd made about inheriting junk. When he walked into the shop and saw what I'd built, his attitude completely changed. Jake admitted that he'd always assumed I got the short end of the stick with the inheritance. He'd been planning to flip his house for a quick profit, but seeing what I'd done with Grandpa's real gift made him reconsider. He ended up keeping the house and fixing it up properly, turning it into something the old man would have been proud of. The grand opening was bigger than I'd expected. The whole neighborhood turned out, along with car enthusiasts from all over the Detroit area. Miguel came by with his wife, and even some of Grandpa's old customers showed up with their classic cars. It felt like a celebration of everything he'd stood for: quality work, honest dealing, and respect for automotive history. My Aunt Linda brought her 1998 Chevrolet, the one she'd inherited from Grandpa. She'd been thinking about selling it, but after seeing the shop, she decided to have me restore it instead. That old Chevy turned out to be in better shape than anyone realized, and when I was done with it, she had something she could pass down to her own kids. The best part was watching people's reactions when they saw the display case with Grandpa's key. Older customers would stop and stare, remembering stories about George and the amazing work he used to do. Younger visitors would ask about the inscription, and I'd tell them the whole story about the mysterious inheritance and the hidden Mustang. One old-timer named Frank told me that he'd known about Grandpa's secret garage all along. Apparently, George had sworn him to secrecy back in the 1970s, and Frank had been waiting 40 years to see what would happen when someone finally found that car. He said Grandpa had always talked about wanting to leave something meaningful behind, something that would inspire the next generation to keep the old traditions alive. Business picked up faster than I'd expected. Classic car owners started making appointments months in advance, and I had to hire 2 additional mechanics to handle the workload. We developed a reputation for taking on projects that other shops wouldn't touch. The weird, the difficult, the the supposedly impossible restorations that required old-school knowledge and modern problem-solving. The financial side worked out better than I'd hoped too. Classic car restoration is a niche market, but it's a profitable one when you do it right. The money from a Mustang sale had given me enough capital to buy quality equipment and hire skilled workers. Within 6 months, the shop was turning a profit and building a waiting list of customers. About a year after opening, I got a call from a collector in California who bought Grandpa's Boss 429 at the Barrett-Jackson auction. He wanted to know if I'd be interested in doing some maintenance work on the car during his next visit to Detroit. Apparently, he'd been so impressed by the car's condition and history that he decided to keep it completely original rather than modify it for shows. When he brought the car in, it was like meeting an old friend. The Mustang looked exactly the same as when I'd found it, still perfect, still carrying all those memories of Grandpa's secret project. The owner had researched the car's history extensively and was genuinely excited to meet the person who discovered it. He told me something that really stuck with me. He said that in all his years of collecting, he'd never seen a car with such a complete and touching backstory. Most collector cars have been through multiple owners, modifications, and restorations. But this one had been loved and preserved by a single person for over 50 years, then passed down to someone who understood its true value. Standing there in my shop, looking at that perfect blue Mustang, I realized that Grandpa had given me something way more valuable than money. He'd given me a purpose, a direction, and a way to honor his memory while building something for the future. Every day I came to work, I was continuing a tradition that started with a young man and his dream car back in 1969. The key in the display case reminds me every day that the most important things in life aren't always obvious. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, ask the right questions, and be willing to follow a mystery wherever it leads. Grandpa knew that when he left me that key, I'd figure out what it meant and what to do with what I found. And now, whenever someone brings me a classic car that everyone else has given up on, I think about that lesson. There's always a solution if you're willing to look for it, and sometimes the best treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places. That's the real legacy Grandpa left me. Not just a car or a business, but a way of looking at the world that turns mysteries into opportunities.